Everybody. As you just heard, we will be recording this webinar. My name is Kara. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the communications manager here at MECEP, or Maine Center for Economic Policy in full. If you were not familiar with MECEP previously to joining this webinar, we are an independent, nonpartisan research and policy organization working to advance equity and prosperity for all Maine people. And that means advocating for fairer tax policies, access to education, healthcare, livable wage jobs, investments in government programs and services Maine people rely on. And we do this largely through policy research, issue framing, and legislative advocacy. And one of the big things we do is that every year we release our State of Working Maine report. And every year we publish a new edition, and every year it has a slightly different theme or central question that it revolves around. And this year, we really wanted to drill down on the issue of Maine's workforce shortage. And we found that this really is the biggest challenge facing Maine's economy. Because without increasing the size of the workforce, there just aren't enough workers to fill new jobs as they're created. So we've received many questions over the years on how to resolve this issue. And with State of Working Maine 2023, we really wanted to put that stake in the ground and show, if you want to grow the workforce, you need to remove the barriers that are holding people back from working in the first place, such as access to childcare, healthcare, housing. So just a couple of housekeeping things. We're going to have a couple special guests along the way. Including Shirley, who is a surgical nurse whose story is featured in the report, Grace Leavitt, who is the president of the Maine Education Association, and Senator Mattie Daughtry. And another thing, feel free to drop your questions in the chat along the way. You don't have to hold them until the end. And with that, I would like to introduce James Myall. James is an economic policy analyst. He is the State of Working Maine author, and he's our lead on building a just and inclusive economy, including research on labor issues, gender and racial equity, and healthcare policy. James conducts research and impact analyses. He writes educational materials. He collaborates with partners. He is just an overall powerhouse on the team. And we're going to go ahead and dig into these report findings. So State of Working Maine 2023 suggests that in order to grow our workforce, we need to do two big things. We need to increase the share of traditional working age Mainers who are employed, so people who are already here, and we also need to support in-migration to increase the pool of potential workers. So James, let's start by exploring how to increase the number of working age Mainers who are employed.
Yeah, thanks, Kara, and thanks for hosting the webinar. This is exciting. So I think traditionally this has been the way that the workforce has increased in Maine and in other states has been by increasing the share of the population that has been working. And sort of in the report, we do focus primarily on kind of a population that's seen as traditionally working age. So those are folks between the ages of about 25, when most folks have finished college, if that's the route they're taking, and under the age of 64, which is kind of around traditional retirement age. And we point to a few different things. I mean, one thing that we note in the report that's important to bear in mind is, there has been this narrative, I think, that it was maybe true early on in some parts of the pandemic about, after COVID, whether people were sort of going back to work. We've actually definitely seen that narrative, that is no longer true, that there are folks staying at home who were impacted by the pandemic. That doesn't really seem to be true in any significant way. If you look at the share of the folks who are working in Maine, it's pretty much back to where it was at pre-pandemic levels. And actually those pre-pandemic levels were some of the highest we'd seen in a number of years. Almost the highest national and state level sort of workforce participation rates were around the year 1999, 2000. And we're pretty close to those levels. But something that we point out in the report is that, there is still room for the workforce to grow in Maine from our existing population. We do point to the example of, if you look at some places like other countries, the United States actually has a lower workforce participation rate among that working age population than other developed countries in many cases. That's especially true for women. And we think a lot of that reason is because of the lack of supports that there are for folks who have other demands on their time. So we talk about the need for, the fact that we're going to have a paid family medical leave program in Maine in the next couple of years should help with that. Stop folks having to drop out when they have a care responsibility. But we also talk about other things, the group people with particular barriers to work. So folks who have disabilities, older adults who often face discrimination, as well as needing special accommodations in the workplace. But then we also talk about, ways to support people and to boost their kind of earning potential. So safety net programs, when people fall out of the labor force, help them to get back in again sooner. It means they don't have long-term periods of unemployment. And, things like the free community college program could be expanded and strengthened to mean that more people have access to means to improve their skills and to increase their earning potential.
Great, thank you very much, James. And with that, we're actually going to speak to someone whose story was featured in our report. Her name is Shirley. She's a surgical nurse with 28 years of experience, and she's currently working in 2 rural hospitals in Washington County. And she's going to talk to us about some issues in the nursing field, largely related around wages and staffing. So Shirley, take it away.
Hi, thank you for asking me to participate in this webinar. I did not know really anything about MECEP beforehand, so I'm actually very interested to learn about it, and glad to hear you guys are out there doing some things at the state level. So working in rural Maine as any sort of employee, I can represent or speak to what happens throughout the whole state, because truly Maine is a rural state. I mean, we've got, 1 point whatever million people in a large landmass, and everybody is rural. So my experiences working in small hospitals are it's been an up and down experience for me, to be honest with you. I love where I am. I feel like I belong here. I don't want to ever leave here, but it's been a rough go of it at different times, certainly with COVID, but really, again, since the economic downturn in 2008, small hospitals have had a really difficult time. There's been a lot of cutbacks. There have been reduction in force things that have happened so that people have left. And then a lot of workers have just left anyway, because the pay scales are lower than many other places they can go, particularly out of state, but even compared to some in-state areas. So it's been rough since 2008. One of the things that has helped in my workplaces, and particularly my primary workplace, is that we are unionized, and it's been pretty much the one thing that has protected us from a lot of the vagaries of an employer that really just wants to move employees from one spot to another spot as needed, when it's not maybe in the best interest of patient safety, when it's certainly not in the best interest of having people be well versed in what they're doing on any particular day of the week. And it takes a lot of the pride in what you do, and you lose that because you feel like you are literally just a pawn being played across a board. So I have to say that our union, the Maine State Nurses Association, has been instrumental in helping us push back when those things have happened. We have not had, of course, not all of our administrations at my hospital have been difficult to work with. Our current administration has helped us out. It's brought our pay scale up. And the interesting thing about that is that when our union has been able to negotiate better pay or better working conditions, that seems to often translate over to the entire employee base in the building. So one of the famous union sayings is, a rising tide lifts all boats. And certainly that's the case that I have experienced here. One of the things that I would like to mention that I don't think I mentioned when I did my interview before was about housing. Because I noticed when I was reading the other people's stories that housing is so critical. Again, rural Maine, you would think that older, maybe smaller homes would be inexpensive, that you could purchase these homes fairly cheaply, or that you could find an apartment in far rural Maine. Boy, is that not true. It is a real struggle. And I see it in the community, but the thing that brings it home to me is, as in a hospital, you know, traveling staff, whether it be a nurse or a respiratory therapist or a physician or somebody in HR, the traveling staff come to our area, and it is a struggle to find decent, reasonable housing. The apartments tend to be very few. They're owned by 1 or 2 or 3 people. So the price tends to get fixed on that, whether or not there's much competition. And the houses, especially since the COVID pandemic took place, the price of property and of housing is just astronomical. Nobody in our area never ever thought we would see prices like we see on these places. So, you know, boy, anything that can be done to provide reasonable, decent housing is fantastic. And I really feel for listening to the stories of people even down in the southern part of the state saying there just isn't anything. There's no affordable housing for anybody, whether they've got a job that pays a living wage or not. I've seen travelers come to our area. I've seen them take apartments in elderly living establishments. I've seen them live in camps that were barely habitable, and I've seen them bring their own RVs. So so that's what it's taking to make it, you know, for a lot of these people. I don't want to take up too much time, so if there's any particular question or anything I should address, I'd be happy to, but I'd like to give other people a chance too.
Thank you so much, Shirley, and thank you again for sharing your story with us in the report, and for drawing attention to housing, because that is a huge issue. And Senator Mattie Daughtry is actually going to speak to that in a little while. So that is very, very relevant. So thank you again. And we are actually going to move to another key sector we've heard a lot from, which is teachers. So I would like to introduce Grace Leavitt, who is the president of the Maine Education Association. And Grace is also a Spanish teacher on leave from Greeley High School in Cumberland. She lives in Raymond and has been teaching for more than 40 years. That's 40, K-12 to higher ed and adult in Maine, Massachusetts, and Spain, and is national board certified. Thank you for joining us today, Grace. If you would like to talk a little bit about the issues facing teachers in the state.
Sure, and thank you. I'm glad I'm able to join. I know the folks whose stories are on your website are busy with students right now, but their stories really are incredibly well representing what I've been hearing from educators across the state for quite some time. The shortages in our state of educators in our nation are something that we were seeing well before the pandemic. And just like so many other things, the shortages were really exacerbated, but they continue to grow. So we've seen a number of educators that are leaving the profession. We've seen that number grow, and we're not talking about retirements. Those numbers have been relatively stable. We're talking about folks that have left education as a profession altogether and going to other professions. We've been monitoring that for a while. We've also seen at the same time fewer people enrolling in teacher prep programs, and in conjunction with that, even a decline in the number of people that complete those programs when they did enroll in them. And just survey after survey, it's made it really clear that compensation is driving much of this. We've heard of the teacher pay gap, which means that someone who has comparable education but is in a different profession earns about 23% more than educators do in our state. That's taking into consideration other factors as well. So that's quite a pay gap there. One of the stories on the website that you have is an experienced teacher who holds a master's degree who's looking for a part-time work in order to help make ends meet and support their family. And that just shouldn't be happening. But it does happen. So a large portion of the issue is trying to fill positions for education support professionals. Those are the essential people that keep our schools running. Ed techs, bus drivers, food service, custodians, secretaries. Our schools just cannot run without these positions filled. And yet we do, because people are covering for those vacancies. And just really taking on incredible workloads in some cases. Shirley just mentioned how people are covering in areas that that's not their usual assignment, and that's happening as well. But again, people are doing what they can to step up. I think one of the comments from one of the ed techs in the stories makes it really clear what one of the issues is. And again, it goes to pay. Her students who haven't yet got their high school diploma are getting jobs in places like Walmart and earning more than she does. And she's been working at her position for over 20 years. So something's not right there. Another ed tech talks about being grateful that she was chosen to have a Habitat for Humanity house. She's had to work a second job, sometimes even a third job, while being an ed tech. And so again, these are folks who are incredibly important for our students. So compensation is really a key issue that we've been working to address as far as raising the minimum teacher salary. We did get it raised a few years ago to $40K, but that still is insufficient when you compare all these other things. And certainly we've got to be making progress on raising the hourly wages for those support staff in our schools. But another thing that is really making it difficult to fill the positions and have the workforce that we need in schools is the diverse needs of our students. We've been seeing a lot more student behaviors that mean our kids need even more supports, along with behavioral types of issues. We've got multilingual learners who need more supports. And again, our educators are being called on to do more and more and to deal with more challenges to help kids learn. This is all while they're covering here and there when positions are going unfilled. The special ed teachers spoke about having a caseload of over 20 students, but the teacher is also performing the duties of an administrator because they don't have a special ed director in the district. Or a school where there's 700 students and one school counselor. So our students do need more supports than we have right now because we don't have the positions filled that we need to have filled for our kids. We saw during the first year or so of the pandemic when schools were doing this hybrid model where they would have smaller groups of students in the classroom at a time, made a huge difference in terms of what teachers were able to do to support their students. We weren't seeing the behavior issues that we're seeing now, and things were just very different with smaller groups. But of course, now when you can't fill another second grade classroom and you have to stretch the teachers that you do have to cover the classes that you need, those class sizes are larger in some places. And that just makes it all that much more difficult for both the educators as well as for the students. So maybe the hardest part of all this, the shortages, is that it takes such a toll on the educators who are in our schools. So while they're covering those vacancies, working with more students, doing what they can to provide all the supports that are needed, and you combine that with a pay that is really not recognizing the value of the work that our educators do or showing the respect that they deserve for the work that they do, that makes it really hard to retain folks in the profession. So I know a lot of things have begun to happen in the last year or two, a lot of initiatives to try to attract people to the field. And in time, they are working and will work. But if we're not also taking the necessary steps to retain people in the field, we're not going to be making the progress we need. And again, it's our students that are feeling the impact of this. So you hear time and time again from educators that we're not in it for the money. Even after 40 plus years and all of the challenges, I will still say this is the best profession in the world. It's very rewarding in other ways. Educators are in it for their students. They really care deeply about kids, but passion for teaching and helping students and passion for education. It just doesn't always pay the bills. And some days even loving what you do just isn't enough. And again, I'm glad to help with any questions, and I could talk about this forever, but I know you've got other people to talk about it as well. So I hope the passion that I'm feeling for what I do and representing educators, because I know how deeply they care about our kids. I hope that's coming through on this loud and clear. Thanks.
Thank you, Grace. And thank you to speaking to that issue that we keep seeing of wages and staffing, right? If there's an issue in one, there seems to be an issue in the other. And as someone who has a lot of teachers in their family, I really appreciate what you said about, educators love the kids. Anyone who is considering leaving the profession is not doing so because of a lack of passion. One of the teachers who spoke to us and shared our story actually said, and I'd like to elevate this quote, "I always tell my kids that I get paid in my heart, not in my pocket. But I don't know a lot of people that can live on their heart when they need to feed themselves and pay for heat." And I think that's what it comes down to for a lot of teachers right now. So thank you again for joining us today. And we are actually going to shift back to the findings of the report and speak to that second part we were talking about earlier, which is supporting in-migration, both from other states and overseas, to increase the pool of potential workers. So James, I'm gonna tag you back in to talk about this second piece of report findings.
Yeah, and before I do that, I would just want to also put a bow on what we just kind of heard from the last two speakers. I think they point to some things that we noted in the report is that, even though, so one of the things that, as I mentioned, there is more potential to increase the workforce in Maine. We do have a relatively high workforce participation rate right now. But one of the things we've seen since the start of the pandemic, since the end of the pandemic, I guess I should say, is that the number of jobs that have been created has kind of outpaced the number of people who are returning to the workforce. And that's one of the things that's contributed to the shortage. In many ways, that's been good for a lot of low wage workers. It's pushed their wages up. But it has also meant kind of this intense competition for workers, and we saw that in some of those stories where highlighting the fact that we haven't been able to, or like local towns and school districts haven't necessarily kept up the wages for teachers to be able to compete with some of these other jobs where wages are increasing. And that's the risk that we face with a potentially long-term plateauing workforce is just a numerical shortage of workers to be able to fill some of these critical jobs like healthcare and education. So we do talk in the report about, in addition to kind of increasing the number of people who are in the state who are working, is increasing the state's population, and especially through folks who could be potential workers. One of the good pieces of news is that a lot of the policies that would make Maine, that would support Mainers, also would make Maine a more attractive place to work to. So that is, policies that support families and support workers, make sure that the wages are sufficient for people to move here. We're going to talk a little bit about housing and make sure housing is affordable for people to move here. And then having policies like paid leave programs, access to care for family members. Also, those are all things that will make Maine a more attractive place to move to as well. We also need to make sure that, one of the things we've seen, and we have seen an increase in migration over the last couple of years, partly from people moving, I think, in the wake of the pandemic. But what we've typically seen in Maine is kind of a relatively narrow set of folks who are moving here. They tend to be disproportionately white compared to the rest of the country. They also tend to come from the same sort of few states. And so I think there's potentially work to do to make sure that it's clear that Maine is a welcoming place for everybody. So that means sort of strengthening our anti-discrimination laws, maybe, with some of the publicity campaigns like the Live and Work in Maine campaign, make sure we're reaching all kinds of communities across the country. And then I think finally we do talk about there is some potential for increased in-migration from overseas. This is kind of a trickier area because obviously at a state level, we don't control kind of immigration policy that's set at the federal level. But I do think, and typically that has been a pretty small portion of the number of people who move to Maine every year. Maybe around 10 or 20% of the people to move to Maine each year are coming from another country rather than from the United States. But we do talk about things we can do to support folks who move here from other countries, especially those folks who are here seeking asylum. They have some very specific urgent short-term needs in terms of housing and basic living conditions. But there are also things we can do to help prepare them for the workforce. And there's also been some initiatives at the federal level to try and allow those folks to be able to get into the workforce sooner, which, as we found when we talked to some folks for our report, is kind of something that a lot of them would really like to be able to do as well.
Thank you, James. And I would actually like to get back to something Shirley was talking about earlier, which is housing, because another key finding of this report was that Maine will not be able to successfully grow its workforce without substantially increasing the supply of housing, because housing has become one of the largest barriers to economic security for Mainers. And if we're going to expand the population to maintain a strong economy, we need to solve the state's affordable housing problem. So joining us to explore this further is Senator Mattie Daughtry. During her time in the Maine House, she authored and passed bills to reduce student debt. She crafted legislation to protect and improve Maine's local food systems. She passed legislation to keep carcinogenic chemicals out of our food, our water, our bodies. We're very excited to have her here with us today. So Senator Daughtry, would you like to elaborate a little bit on housing issues and some possible solutions?
Absolutely. And first off, thank you so much for having me, MECEP, and also for the work that you do in this report. It is always nice to be able to see, folks who are not in the thick of it in the legislature, be able to read sort of how the trends are aligning with a lot of the work we're doing as well. So when it comes to housing, I sort of look at this for three different lenses. My work as a legislator, as a state senator, also as a small business owner, and the impact housing has on not only my business, but my employees. And also personally, this is something that has impacted myself, my friends, and my family. So first, on a legislative level, this is such an important issue for the legislature that, we have convened a special housing committee that has been meeting over the 2 years of the legislature to look at, sort of breaking down silos and what are the obstacles to be able to bring those 84,000 units of housing that Maine Housing identified in the report that we need by 2030. And as the MECEP report points out, that number that was calculated doesn't even necessarily have enough population coming in to be able to meet the workforce needs that we have. And so when I'm talking about that, I always like to sort of norm set for folks to remind people that that's like alarms blaring level of housing. That's not even necessarily what we need. We have funneled historic amounts of investment into housing in the legislature over the past 4 years. Additionally, last legislature, I was the chair of the Labor and Housing Committee when we were working LD 2003, former Speaker Fecto's historic zoning bill that really made it so that throughout the state, we were able to really look at creative housing solutions like accessory dwelling units. All of those are well and good, but the problem that we're facing, everything is multifaceted in this world, is a real problem with our workforce. And we can throw as much money after this as we want, but the problem is that we don't have enough people in our construction workforce to be able to bring enough units online. And I think this is where it sort of gets a little bit personal for me. I actually grew up with a father who designed and built houses. So I grew up on a construction site. I've watched what that workforce has been like. I've watched my dad's subs age, and I've had them numerous times say that, you wanted to be a teacher, now you're a legislator. If you're really looking to make some money, come be a plumber. But kidding aside, we really need to diversify. And a lot of, these subs that I know want to retire, but they also want to pass on their knowledge. So we need to do everything we can to be able to know, to interest students in these professions. I think we need to take away some of the stigma that sometimes is seen of, this alternative track, and also diversify it. Over 90% of the construction workforce is not made up of women, it's male. And I know a lot of people are still stunned when they hear I'm able to do my own plumbing and be able to work on my house. And I think all Mainers should have access to that. So we need to keep working on that aspect. The other thing I'll say, personally, the factoid I always lead with is, as a state senator for this district, I wouldn't be able to afford to be the state senator for my district if I had not been able to get my house when I did. The current average price, for example, for Freeport for a single family home is $618,000. I don't know if you know how much legislators make, but Google it, and that is not a mortgage that works. And I am not alone. When it comes to our small business, we've seen a large portion of our employees have to move out of Brunswick because they can't afford housing. And so I watch my own small workforce have to struggle to be able to be within a reasonable driving distance. The other thing we really need to think about with all of those different lenses is how we create housing and what type of housing. Too often we've had sort of a cookie cutter aspect of we just need more apartments or we need more large single family homes. And when we look throughout the country and throughout the world, we need diversified models, whether those are single room occupancies, studios, pocket villages, co-housing. We need to be throwing everything at the wall and making sure that we're not leaving any model behind. Because if you look at that in-migration that we're looking for and that workforce we're hoping to recruit, not everyone wants to live on 2 acres with a 2,000 square foot home. We need to be able to find something that works for all ages, whether you're just starting your career and you're looking maybe for a studio apartment, or maybe you're hoping to age in place and looking for a diverse age range sort of co-housing situation. We need to make sure we're not doing any one size fits solution. I feel like no matter what part of my life I'm in, whether I'm pouring beer or I'm in the legislature, all of my conversations come back to 2 things: education, not to follow up with what Grace said, and housing. And, you know, this is something that's going to take not just the legislature, it's not just going to take advocacy groups, it's going to take all of us really leaning in and trying to find a way to creatively meet, you know, our needs and find the solutions that work.
Great. Thank you so much again for joining us. And speaking of solutions, James, in addition to what Senator Daughtry and others have mentioned so far, what can be done about this issue? You know, why don't we go through some of the other solutions outlined in the report?
Yeah, and there are quite a few different things we point to in the report. I mean, I think a couple of things in terms of the issues that have already come up around care. You know, one of the things we point to, you know, I mentioned that, you know, Canada, for example, has a very high rate of working age women who are able to participate in the workforce. And a lot of folks have pointed both to the paid leave program that they have, but also to some of their subsidized childcare programs. In the province of Quebec, for example, they came up with a pretty innovative, and now it's been there for a couple of decades now, of a very broad network of state subsidized childcare networks, childcare providers, so that about 3/4 of children in that province now have access to care, and the lowest income parents only pay $8.50 per day for care, which, as someone who has recently had 3 different children in childcare in Maine, seems pretty wonderful. And so, you know, that resolves some of the fundamental issue that we see in childcare of, you know, currently we have a system where workers are not being paid enough to stay in that sector, and yet it's still unaffordable for parents. And so a state subsidy is kind of one way to bridge some of those gaps. Kind of similarly, we've also been doing some research, and some of my colleagues at MECEP have been researching kind of the adult care workforce. That's another sector where it's sort of unaffordable for a number of people to be able to use it. But it's also an area in which workers are just not being paid enough. And so there are ways in which we can increase the way that the state pays for adult care through the Maine Care program, for example. And then maybe other things we can do to kind of improve working conditions in that sector as well. You know, on the factors, you know, we point to housing. You know, I think Senator Daughtry did a really good job talking about how we want to have kind of a kind of multi-pronged approach to housing. So there's some really interesting different solutions in front of the legislature there that we're also looking at as well. I think, you know, we've made a good start with some programs like the free college program for community college program. Currently that's available for like currently graduating high school seniors or folks who have completed their GED. I think we could do some more things like making it available to folks as adults who are going back to college. We should also be looking at maybe extending it into the university system. Things like that would also help to retain folks who might currently be moving out of state for college and help kind of strengthen their ties to Maine as well. And finally, some of the things we talk about, especially for new Mainers who are here, who aren't able to work yet, I already mentioned sort of petitioning the federal government to change the policy. But there are also things we could do in terms of helping those folks have access to driver's licenses, helping them to be able to take kind of English language classes, or be able to help them afford some of their immigration documents and the fees that they have to pay for those. helping to recognize credentials from a lot of these folks who were born overseas and maybe have, there's often a stereotype of the folks that, the stereotype is the person who's a brain surgeon in their home country and is driving a taxi when they come to the United States. But there is some truth to that, and we see a lot of folks who aren't able to use their skills. So there are things we could do to make it easier for these credentials to be recognized from overseas and to some extent from out of state as well. So those are just some of the things we highlight in the report in general.
Great, thank you, James. And we're actually going to move into the Q&A portion now. But to get us started, I'd actually like to lift up a comment from the chat, which was from Scott Cuddy. And he said, when we talk about access to childcare, we need to remember that not all jobs are 9 to 5. Teachers need to have access for a 6 to 6:30 a.m. drop-off, and construction workers can need even earlier drop-off times. So I wonder if you'd like to respond to that at all, James.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's broadly true, and that is something we should be bearing in mind, that we should have, as much as possible, we should have a variety of different childcare options. And that, sometimes that gets lost in the fact that, we don't even have a very robust network right now of sort of that narrowly 9 to 5 childcare drop-off. So sometimes we're so busy focusing on the short-term need that we don't think about sort of the ideal longer-term situation. But yeah, I definitely agree that we should be supporting folks who have a variety of different needs in those areas.
Great, and yes, thank you for bringing that up, that expanding access includes remembering that not everybody works 9 to 5. So moving into questions, as one of the workers we interviewed mentioned, specifically referencing how small classroom sizes are helpful, but many schools have now reverted to larger settings. The situation we're in today represents a failure to act on learnings from COVID. So what are your reflections on this?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the interesting things about going through this report is that like many of the problems in here are not necessarily brand new. I mean, they're particularly acute now, I think, in terms of a workforce shortage. But, some folks may know I was a historian in a previous life, and, I enjoyed looking back and seeing that, that you can find articles from sort of 10, 15, 20 years ago that are talking about a pending workforce crunch or a housing crisis. And so, these are all things that we've known about that have got particularly acute, and I think the pandemic has made them worse. But they are things that we've known about beforehand. So I do think, I think there are some ways in which some of us are learning some of the lessons from COVID. I think actually one of the positive outcomes has been sort of the tight labor market and the pushing up of wages for folks at the lower, who are doing a lot of, at the lower end of the wage spectrum, people are doing a lot of the service retail jobs. But obviously, as we've seen, if wages for other things like education technicians or nurses in those critical services are also not increasing, that's just creating a workforce shortage in a different part of the population. So I think it's definitely something where we should be recognizing. And I think one of our storytellers says something along those lines of it's great to have been recognized as a hero working in the healthcare sector. But now suddenly that like heroic status has gone away, and we're left sort of trying to work 2 jobs to make ends meet. So it's definitely something that I hope we can continue that valuing of all workers as being essential and all work needing to have dignity.
Thank you, James. And we actually did just get a question from an audience member. Is there anything pending currently on the state level to improve subsidies for childcare providers that might allow more to stay open or encourage new centers to open?
So I believe we did in the last legislative session, we had started a childcare subsidy or a subsidy for childcare providers and childcare workers during the pandemic using some of the rescue fund money that the federal government had sent out. And I believe we did continue that in the most recent budget. There are some things that are still that will help. There are some things that are being considered in terms of making sure that the subsidy kind of aligns to seniority and experience of childcare workers. So the most experienced workers are sort of compensated more. And I think sort of over the longer term, there are ways that we should be looking at. I think there are some proposals along these lines of making sure that we can have a program that both provides kind of a subsidy for parents to be able to afford the childcare, but also for workers to be able to work in the profession and not face burnout. So there are some proposals, and then there's still some more work to do, I think, in that sector. I think the question in terms of the question about encouraging more centers to open, I think, is an interesting one. I haven't seen as much attention on that, but I imagine there is something there where, you know, there's a certain amount of barrier there in terms of like creating new centers from scratch that would be interesting to think more about.
Excellent. And we are going to take one more question and then close. So the final question is, which upcoming legislation is most attainable in your view, and which is most challenging?
That's a good question. I mean, I think I always like to think all of them are attainable in some way or another, but sometimes reality kind of proves me a little optimistic there. I mean, I think sort of I think it's been encouraging to see how much progress we have been making, albeit sort of incrementally, on some of the things like housing and care, because I think those have risen to the top as being sort of really important issues for folks. I mean, I think there's a lot of potential of the community college and access to education questions, as we've made that big first step of making community college free for some folks, that we could expand that, and it's been successful. I think people would agree so far. So it's been really great. I mean, I think something that I didn't mention that I think is a more challenging, I think, or a longer term goal is sort of the bigger question of access to healthcare. We see a lot of folks not able to participate fully in the workforce because they have a health problem. And obviously, you know, healthcare is complicated and it's a big issue. And so I think it's something where there is still momentum behind it, but sort of getting to a place where we don't have folks who are unable to afford healthcare and therefore unable to sort of work as much as they'd like because they've got some sort of chronic health condition. Yeah, that's the ideal goal, is we should be getting to somewhere like that, where no one's in that situation. But I think that's going to take a few more years of work to get there.
Thank you. And we actually did get another question in the chat, so I'd like to go to that before we close. How are you engaging and collaborating with immigrant-run and serving organizations?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we've been trying to do more of every year, and sort of as part of our commitment to sort of represent all kinds of Mainers in low and middle income situations. You know, increasingly that includes a number of folks from immigrant backgrounds. So we've worked reasonably closely with like the Maine Immigrant Rights Coalition, and they were some of the folks who helped to review some of the recommendations and added to them in this report, which was super handy. So yeah, we've been trying to do that, and we've been also working on some policies sort of in coalitions with folks. So I think we've been trying to lift up some of the concerns that these folks have. So increasing access to Medicaid, the Maine Care program, so that folks who are here can qualify regardless of their immigration status. That's been a big project for us recently. And some of the projects around, you know, helping with general assistance and housing assistance are also pretty important to that community. So there's always more work we can try and do. And as Karen mentioned, my colleague Karen mentioned, we're also part of a work permit advocacy coalition. So we're trying to strengthen our ties to those groups, and it's always one of our goals is always to kind of like support those groups in their work and kind of help them build more capacity as well.
Thank you, James. And with that, we are going to close for the day. Contact info for James is in the chat if you have any questions for him, or you can reach out to info@mecep.org for general inquiries anytime. The event today has been recorded. We'll share that out in an email following the close of the webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. I do want to say quickly, we have another webinar on Thursday that is specifically for labor leaders and workers. So if there's someone you think should be there, we'll include a registration link in the email we sent out as well, if you want to let folks know about that. So thank you very much to everybody for joining us today, and have a good rest of your day.